This is the Capitalism and Freedom in the 21st Century podcast, an official podcast of the Hoover Institution Economic Policy Working Group, where we talk about economics, markets, and public policy. I'm Jon Hartley, your host. Today, my guest is Art Laffer, a legendary economist who is the famous namesake and popularizer of the Laffer Curve, which depicts the relationship between tax rates and tax revenue. On top of Art's career in academia, he's also an investor, having founded Laffer Investments, and has advised countless politicians, from Richard Nixon, working in the Nixon administration, to Ronald Reagan, working in the Reagan administration, working on Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board, and most recently, working with President Trump, who awarded Art the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2019. Welcome, Art.
Thank you very much, John. It's so nice to see you again.
So great to see you as always. And I really am excited here to talk to you because I know you well, and I really want to, I think, shine a light on your early life and all your incredible accomplishments. I'm curious, how did you first get interested in economics, and how did you make your way to Yale and then to Stanford to do your PhD in economics to study under the famous international economist Ron McKinnon? I've seen your PhD dissertation here. We have a room with all the PhD dissertations of past Stanford students, and I've seen yours in this room of many red books with all the dissertations. I'm curious, what was it like when you were here, and how did you actually get interested in economics in the first place?
Well, it was really cool. I got interested in economics. I went to the University of Munich. I took a year off from Yale. By the way, I got into Yale by privilege. My dad went there. Both my brothers went there. We are a Yale family, so it was natural, just sort of an inherited thing there. And I took a year off at the University of Munich, where I had been a math major at Yale, and I got to Munich, and they didn't have any math courses I hadn't had, so I decided to try Betriebswirtschaft and Volkswirtschaft, which is macro and microeconomics. I fell in love with it. Came back to Yale, changed my major, was an economist there, majored in it, did cleaned up, hit the ceiling, then went to Stanford Business School. Family's business. My dad was head of a large company in America for many years, privileged family, all that. And I fell in love with economics. I took all these courses. I took my core exams in the econ department. When I was in the business school, I was the only student to do that out of something like 200 students. And I aced them. So I switched over and I got my PhD in economics after my MBA. And then I went to the University of Chicago, where I took my first year as a year's leave of absence to go to Brookings Institution with Emile Desprez, who was a professor at Stanford. And it's all written in the stone from there on, my career. But I love Stanford. I love the business school, and I love switching into the econ department. And Ron McKinnon was spectacular, as was Emile Desprez, by the way. We had a big, good group of international economists back then, and that's my specialty, pure trade and international money. And they were really terrific. And I got my first publication in the AER before I entered graduate school in the economics department. How's that, huh?
That's amazing.
In fact, my first publication was in Reagan's first economic report of the governor in 1967. How's that? That's my first citation. So how's that for cool?
Wow, that's amazing.
Isn't that fun?
Now, okay, so I guess a few questions. So like Ron McKinnon, for those who don't know, Ron McKinnon, famous international economist, spent most of his career at Stanford. I think, maybe like a 50 plus year career. And he focused, is famous for coining financial repression, focused on China a bit later. I mean, I'm curious what it was like at that time. My sense is like, Stanford, I always think of it as it's the sort of department that Ken Arrow and others built, or it's kind of the environment that Ken Arrow and others built. But I'm curious, what was it like, at the business school at the time? What was it like doing the MBA and segueing into PhD? Strangely, I also sort of have an MBA and finishing a PhD and all that as well. But I'm curious, what was that like in California at the time? I mean, Governor Reagan in California. What was California like?
Well, he wasn't
That
quite there
time?
yet. I mean, remember, I came in 63, and Reagan didn't take office until 67. So the first part was still under Edmund G. Pat Brown there, and it was a very exciting, I don't know what it's like today in the courses, John. I don't. But at that time, Stanford was extraordinarily rigorous. Mathematics. Ron McKinnon was no BS, period. He had me do proofs and theorems there. I was worked for Moses Abramovitz. I was the proofreader for Why Growth Rates Differ by Ed Dennison. So this is the detailed numerical stuff and detailed mathematical stuff. So we worked in statistics and math very, very heavily at that time. And I think it softened a great deal, to be honest with you, at Stanford. But we came out of there, we were
They let me in clearly that, you know.
well, it's not who they let in, it's who they let out. That's important. And I am sure you're going to be let out a better man and a better economist as but that time you really had to be rigorous. And McKinnon was as rigorous as anyone was. Emile Desprez was the love of the century. I mean, I just love that man more than anything. Ken Arrow was an important part of the department, but he was separate. He was in whatchamacallit house, Sarah House, which was where Ken Arrow and the mathematical economists, we were all in Encina Hall there, the whole group of us, which you probably don't even have anymore. The business school wasn't built. We were all at History Corner, but it were two very different things. And I had very little interaction with Ken Arrow, a lot of interaction with McKinnon, with Emile Desprez, with Paul David, Paul Hohenberg, a good group of solid economists there. I just
That's
loved it. Just loved it.
That's fantastic. And my understanding is, I think some of the mathematical economics, Ken Arrow sort of grew out separately. I mean, we have like the MS&E department as well, which is a little separate. So there's all these different groups of economic scholars or economics related scholars here, and between certainly in these times, we've got Hoover and we've got the Stanford Economics Department. There's CEPR. We've got the business school. There's also sort of the political science departments, FSI, which is just foreign policy, and sort of all these folks are doing economics to some degree. I'm curious, like, I guess HP has always, I think, been one of those big, I think, founding sort of companies, if you will, in the area. I mean, was the tech was this known as
My
a tech place
job,
at the time, or not
my
yet?
job when I was at Stanford, I was, very young. Obviously, I came in, I was married. Most people were not. I had a baby, so I had a family, and so I worked at night. I was night watchman in Shockley Transistor and 1800 Page Mill Road, which was the opening one. That was before the group left and formed their new company there, before all the deserters left Shockley. So I was night watchman there. So yeah, we were really big on that. In fact, Shockley asked me to be his research assistant in the university, and I told him I really didn't have time to do that. I could, as night watchman, I could do all my homework there, 4 hours every night. And he wanted me to come in and actually be a real serious research assistant and do this genetics research. Thank God I didn't do that, John. Just what I need is another scar on my back for whatever conservative stuff these guys do.
Oh, great. Well, okay. So, did you know anyone in the early, like any of the early Reagan people, who were in California and advising him at that time? Did you cross paths with any of
Well,
them, or
later on, I did very
no?
much so. My godfather was Justin Dart, who was Reagan's best friend. And so my relationship with Reagan was strictly familial, was privileged, was all of that. When you're someone's best friend, you get intersect in the circles. And so when I came back to California in 76, I was immediately in the social set with Reagan. When Bob Hope died, for example, I was the escort for Dolores Hope, and all of us in the Beverly Hills Bel Air, that era, Palos Verdes, Rolling Hills. That was mine as I was the kid and all of that. So that's how I really got to be superly close with Reagan and all the people around Reagan. But I knew them all really, really well and doing a lot now with it.
Terrific, terrific. Okay, so California, your first job coming out of Stanford was at University of Chicago.
A first, yeah, job, yes. But I took a leave of absence my first year out and I went to
At
Brookings.
Brookings.
At Brookings. And then I came back to Chicago where I'd never been before.
So
And
I'm
then
curious, and I know you later taught at USC and Pepperdine as well. I'm curious, what was like the U Chicago? This would have been, I guess, in the late 60s, early
66,
70s.
67, that era. I came back for 1 year My second year on the faculty, my first year in location, I was pretty lucky. I got a lot of published articles in the top journals everywhere at AER, all of these things there. And so I think I got the fastest promotion to tenure at Chicago in their history in econ, promoted to tenure. And then George Shultz in 1970 asked me to go to the White House with him as his right-hand person. So I was the top staff economist in the White House from 1970 to 1972. In the first year of the Office of Management and Budget, it had been the Budget Bureau before, but when Shultz came over and took it over, he changed it to the Office of Management and Budget, and I was his choice. My first thing before I even got my office was to go to China with him and John Ehrlichman, and made the first trip to China. So I was the first American in modern times, at least, to go to China in October of 1970. And it was just all cool stuff. I mean,
It's
I
amazing.
had no idea how cool it was until later.
It's amazing, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate Schultz as Treasury Secretary. I think he's tied with I think the most number of cabinet appointments, and
Yes, he was.
obviously a big a huge influence here at Hoover. But I think that some of the things that I think people don't really appreciate, this about that time and what was going on was on the sort of the Treasury side of things was I think the creation of what was the predecessor to the G7. We have all these G7 meetings today. I think that was very much created out of the Schultz Treasury at that time.
Well, that
Um,
was before Schultz Treasury that I'm talking about. Here he was head of the Office of Management Budget. His first job was Secretary of Labor. And then when he moved over to be head of the Office of Management and Budget, this newly created agency, is when I joined him in 1970. Now, at that time was just before the Camp David wage and price controls, devaluation of the dollar, the 10% import tax surcharge, all the stuff you and I hate and despise and disagree with to the limit. But Nixon, I enjoyed Nixon personally very, very much. But this was George Shultz's first thing there. And
mhm.
then, of course, what he did was he left that. He went become Secretary of the Treasury. And I went with him for that. I was his consultant 2 days a week from the University of Chicago. I went in there and I had my own little office right next to his, right across the little hall there. And it was just a cool, cool time. That's when we went off gold, when we devalued the dollar. We did all the Smithsonian Accord, all of that stuff occurred in that period.
It's
Uh,
amazing.
and
It's
it
amazing.
was a very exciting period, a very, in my way, bad period in sense of economics. I mean, it's when government finally monopolized money. As you know, John, before 1913, money was private. There was no government money. Now, the government did do three things. It defined what a dollar was. It's 1/20th of an ounce of gold. It's 1 ounce of silver. That's what they defined that. Then the government also, prior to 1913, did have a mint that minted coins. If you brought in bullion, it minted coins correctly and charged a fee for it. So did a lot of other places mint coins. And the third thing the government did, which was really important, was that it audited banks' balance sheets. So if you said your balance sheet and your income statement was such, they went in and audited it and made sure it was true. And what was before 1913, there was no currency as we know it. There was banknotes, which were issued by individual banks. Some sold a slight discount or premium to another bank or so, but that was the money back then. And obviously, from 1790 until 1912, let's say, the U.S. had bibbles and bobbles and inflation, but there was no generalized inflation for 130 years there. And then, of course, once we started the Fed, which was in 1913, the government started to monopolize money. Then Roosevelt devalued the dollar from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce. Ba 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 ba. Interest equalization tax, voluntary foreign trade, ending up in the Smithsonian. In the next 120 years or so, we've had huge inflation. I think the price levels increased 33-fold. It's just another example how government shouldn't be in the business of doing what the private sector does better. There should be no government money. There should only be private money today, and it should not be run by Powell. I mean, what? I mean, this guy's not competent, and government shouldn't run money. It should be private.
So we'll get into
Did I
monetary
get you? I
policy.
got you to a different field, didn't I? Quickly, huh?
I know. So I guess this is my question for you. So you're working at U Chicago. You're working at OMB. You're a consultant working with Shultz. Going back and forth between Washington. You were there at Chicago in the late '60s, and around that time, you're hired as an international economist.
Yep.
And I'm sure at that time, my guess is you were probably in the same seminars as Harry Johnson, the famous.
Well, Bob Mundell was the best, was the leading international economist of the world back then. I worked with Mundell. It's the Mundell-Laffer hypothesis. It's all the stuff we worked together. He was my primary thing. Very big fan of Ron McKinnon's, both of them Canadian, both of them the same economics. He loved my training with Emile Desperry and Ron McKinnon,
Yeah.
and we did tons and tons of work together. He took me
All
under his
three of them
wing.
were Canadian. Robert
I know.
Mundell is Canadian, Harry Johnson Canadian, Ron McKinnon
Yeah,
Canadian. And I
yeah.
mean, some people would argue that part of what inspired the Mundell-Fleming hypothesis or conjecture, and trilemma was the fact that Canada was actually the first sort of break off from the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system in the '50s and to float briefly before they went back. And
It almost got killed.
and that sort of influenced Mundell to start thinking about,
Yeah.
should we have a fixed exchange rate regime, floating exchange rate regime? Mundell and Milton Friedman had obviously this, very big debate in that
Well,
time.
we were all fixed exchange rates. We were gold standard people. Mundell and I and Paul Volcker in there, and Milton Friedman was floating rates. And just for the record, floating rates don't work. They
But yeah,
don't
I
work
mean,
when you have a
it's a debate that still goes on to this day.
yeah,
Um,
but it shouldn't.
yeah, well, I mean, the end, I guess, of Bretton Woods and the breakdown of the fixed exchange rate system. Yeah, it's ushered in
The
this,
fixed
now.
exchange rate system didn't break down. The fixed exchange rate system was demolished by sabotage.
Yeah, well,
We had no problem with a fixed rate system for 3, 4 centuries before 1913. It did really well. And it did the monopoly of government and then floating rates did really badly post 1913. And it ended up squirrely as all get out. We almost went back to fixed rates with Reagan. We came very close.
Well, there was the
But
Gold Commission, Schwartz kind of led, and there was a bit of a revisiting of some of these things.
a total revisiting, and Reagan was a hard money person, as was Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker was gold standard all the way.
And
And we
did
got,
he?
yeah.
I mean, Volcker wanted a zero to his, for his entire life wanted a 0% inflation target.
Me
Volcker.
too. Me too. Mundell
Uh,
too.
why, I guess the argument was, why have 2% over, long periods of time? It's a lot of inflation, but you should have 0%. Instead was the argument. I mean, was it Friedman who was pushing back and
Yes.
fighting for
Yes.
flexible
100% Friedman.
exchange rates, and who
Yeah.
kind of won over Reagan in that?
It was 100% Friedman through George Shultz that got the Camp David to go to floating, devalue the dollar, go off gold, and to have the Smithsonian Accord where you had a floating rate. 100% Milton Friedman. Now, there were a lot of other economists who agreed with him, but he was the push. He was the one with George who convinced George to get in there and get the president to go along with it. And I differed with him on that uh, very much so to express it. But George was the most wonderful person in the world. You could disagree with George or whatever without being disagreeable. And as his staffer, the only thing I always wanted was that he listened to me. Not that he agreed with me. I was never elected to make decisions. I'm only there as an advisor, the same way I am with Trump, the same way I was with Reagan, by the way. I'm only there as an advisor. You make the decision, but as long as you listen, I'm fine with you. And that was the same thing was true with Nixon. I disagreed with almost everything Nixon did. Devaluation going off cold, tax increases, you name it, wage and price controls. I mean, but there wasn't a thing Nixon did that I did. But I liked Nixon very much personally. I love George Shultz.
Yeah, I mean, Nixon, arguably, was, I think one of the smartest presidents that we've had. The all sort of policies and other activities aside. But I guess the Friedman argument for flexible exchange rates was, if you have PPP, if you're fixing exchange rates, then it kind of allows prices to jump out of whack, and I guess this
But
anyway.
that's all. That's all. Yeah, how do they get out of whack between Chicago and Cleveland? That's a
I,
fixed rate system, isn't it now?
well,
How about between California and New York? Are they out of whack? California should devalue. Come on.
But this is the
A
whole Mundell
common
argument,
currency.
optimal currency area.
Well, the optimal currency area was the one about Canada, the West versus the East. What Mundell really pushed for very much was a currency area, and a common currency area, which he put to Europe. That wasn't an optimal currency area in Europe. It was the euro that he thought should be the total currency, and that should be juxtaposed against the dollar, maybe against the yen, whatever. But Mundell was very much the fixed exchange rates. If you see his article, mine was two arguments for fixed exchange rates, and his was the case for fixed exchange rates. We did all that stuff. Mundell was very much in that line.
Right.
When he
When
did the
he
optimal
influenced the
currency,
creation of the euro. I mean,
well,
that
that is what getting rid of floating rates.
exactly. Floating, yeah,
And
floating exchange
thank
rates.
God. And he was right. He's been right on all of these things, and we're still pushing to get back to a sound monetary standard. And that's why the euro, that's why Bitcoin is doing so well. That's why gold is so high priced. Everyone wants to get out of government monies. They just are crap things, and they want a private money system back again.
So,
One money system for the world.
so I guess the question, how did you become a tax economist out of all this? You're international coming out of graduate school. Obviously, money and all these things front and center in the late 1960s, and hanging out with Mundell and or being colleagues with Mundell and all these like Friedman and so forth. How did was tax
It was
policy
a
always
terrible. It's like getting a virus. It's like getting a bacteria in your system. It comes and eats you alive. I was the chief economist at the OMB when it was formed in the White House. So as far as credentialed economists, I was the rank number one there in the White House. The Council of Economic Advisors was over in the old executive office building, and you're immediately involved in all policy matters. And I developed a little model that are called the Formal Model of the Economy, which was published in the Journal of Business in 1972, I think it was. And there I did a test of the monetarist model, the Keynesian model, and the efficient markets model. Back then, we didn't have supply side. And I got into some real deep trouble. Government spending using the seasonally unadjusted co-adjusted. You can go back and look at the article there. It created huge kerfluffle in the world. If you go back and look at the article there, I found that government purchases of goods and services increased GDP by the amount of the increase in purchases of goods and services in the first quarter, and then for the next 3 quarters went back down to where it otherwise would have been. So it was 100% crowding out of shifting government for there, and I couldn't understand that. And government transfer payments actually reduced GDP growth. So I was struggling with this, being trained as a macroeconomist back then. I was struggled with this terribly, and finally came to the conclusion it's incentives and supply. If you tax people who work and you pay people who don't work. Do I need to say the next sentence to you, John? No, that was supply side economics. When government spending reduces output, not increases it. Taxes are a disincentive to work output and employment. Transfer payments pay people not to work. They tax people who do work. And that was the evolution of supply side economics, which is the exact opposite of Keynesian or monetarism. I am not a monetarist at all. I'm not a Keynesian. I personally believe that people don't work because they're jobs. I believe that people work to get paid, and they get paid after tax. I don't believe that people save their money because of their incomes being higher. I believe they save their money to make an after-tax rate of return on their investments. Hello, it's an incentive-based model. I believe that if you have two locations, A and B, if you raise taxes in B and you lower taxes in A, producers and manufacturers are going to move from B to A. People can change the location of their income, the timing of their income, the volume of their income, and the composition of their income, all based on taxation. And that came out of my paper in 1972. And I was at sixes and nines. I was completely at odds with my own concept until all of a sudden this classical model started rolling in on me, and bang. And then you can see all the rest from that. Mundell was right there with me the whole time. It was just a great fun. And that's why now I spend so much time on macro. It's just incentive economics, John. That's all it is.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
nothing more, nothing less, just like international economics.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating. I think there's now, or roughly 50 years later, I think there's a whole renaissance going on in fiscal research, and a lot of work done by Valerie Ramey here, and work done by John Taylor as well. Just showing that fiscal multipliers are much smaller than people I think
They
originally
don't
thought.
exist. They're negative. They're negative, John. They're
Well,
negative, negative. Have you ever heard of a person spending himself into wealth? It's stupid. Have you ever heard of an economy taxed into prosperity? It makes no sense. Now,
well,
there are certain functions the government does that it does better, like military and stuff like that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about transfer payments. We're talking about that. And let me, if I can, I go through with 1 second with you on the transfer
sure.
theorem? Because this is so important, John. The transfer theorem is that all transfers are when you take income from one group and give it to another group. That's a transfer. We usually think of it in terms of from those who have a little bit more to those who have a little bit less. You with me?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you take from those who have a little bit more and give to those who have a little bit less, by taking from those who have a little bit more, you reduce their incentives to produce, and they will produce a little bit less. By giving to those who have a little bit less, you provide them with an alternative source of income other than working, and they too will produce a little bit less. The theorem here, and it's a theorem, it's not my opinion, it's not I'm tall, I'm short, I'm Harvard, it's math. Whenever you redistribute income, you always reduce total income. And that's the whole basis of stimulus spending is redistribution of income, and it doesn't work. It
So
always reduces income.
I mean, my sense is that having looked at a lot of the state myself as well, and this is the arguments that John Taylor and Valerie Ramey and others have made, is that really the challenge with transfers is that they largely get saved and they don't get spent. So this idea that like,
That's
well,
not the truth.
people
That's wrong. Let me just say the problem with transfers is they have to be taken from someone else
well,
and
that's
then
true
given
too.
to.
I mean,
No, 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 that's
you're
not
absolutely
true.
right.
That's not true too. That is all that's true. By taking from people who have, you reduce their spending because they now have less than they otherwise would have had. That will destimulate the economy in the same way the people who receive the money will spend more. The recipients of transfer payments will spend more. That's true. But the payers of transfer payments will spend less. The income effects, get your Slutsky equation out. This is where training today is so bad. Get your damn Slutsky equation out. And in an economic system, the income effects always, for a transfer or a tax rate change, always sum to zero. Always. But the substitution effects don't. I
Mhm.
had this problem with Senator Nelson in 1974 when we were talking about the $600 tax rebate from Jerry Ford, blah, 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 that guy. And I was trying to explain the substitution effects to the senator, and I couldn't find it. I said, and I was testifying with Gardner Ackley, Paul McCracken, and Otto Eckstein. Okay, they were the three senior grown-up economists who really wanted to do this transfer. And finally, I said to the senator, I said, sir, if those three economists are correct, that $600 stimulus will increase output, employment, and production, what in the hell's the matter with you? Why only do $600? Why not 6,000, 60,000, 600,000, 6 million? Why not 100% of GDP? So everyone who produces and works receives nothing, and all those who don't work and don't produce receive everything. What do you think would happen to GDP? And he goes, God, it would
Probably
go to
not much.
zero. It would go to zero. And that's right. And these guys just they don't understand straight up from Sikkim. A transfer system, a la Keynesian, is you take from someone and their spending goes down. You give to someone else, their spending goes up. That's true. That's a
Mhm.
zero sum game. But the substitution effects make it a huge negative sum game. And that's why the transfer theorem is so true. Every time you transfer resources, you reduce total production. Period. Sorry, John.
No, I'm with you. I mean, on incentive effects,
Well,
I'm with
get that Kogan guy and get him on here TV
John.
with.
Yeah,
Come on,
John
get him,
Kogan.
get them all on here.
I-
Let's go to
John
let's
Kogan's
have a good.
terrific.
Have
Absolutely.
me out there to Hoover and do a debate. A
Ab-
good and redistribution is the same silly thing. These guys at MIT, Saez and Piketty and Sancheva and all those blah whatever, you know, everyone knows that the only way of having equality in income is when everyone's zero.
Hmm.
That's it. That's the transfer theorem and the limit function. And everyone knows the data show that every time we've raised the highest tax rate on income earners, every single time, John, the economy has underperformed, tax revenues from the rich have gone down, and the poor have been hammered. Every
Absolutely.
time we've cut tax rates from the rich, the opposite. Economy has outperformed, tax revenues from the rich go up, and the poor have been provided employment and good income earning opportunities.
Yeah.
And
I don't think you get much disagreement from folks who are, and as you point out,
eh,
John Cogan has an excellent book, the high cost good intentions, which is excellent. I
why
want to
don't you
just
look at
say,
taxations? Taxes have consequences. I looked at every single tax return in the US. We have the data. If this is not an opinion piece, I could give a damn what your opinion or anyone else's opinion is, and you should give a damn about mine. This is about facts, not how you feel. And the facts are whenever we raise tax rates on the rich, the economy underperformed. Whenever we lowered them, it outperformed.
mhm,
Revenues, exact same, and the poor.
abs-
Bingo. What more do you want?
so I just want to get a little bit into just the history of how the
Sure.
Laffer Curve became famous, because I think this
Oh,
is sort of
God.
a long story.
Well,
Involves a
he
lunch,
became
1970.
obnoxious and then famous for being obnoxious first.
Well, involves a lunch in 1974, a napkin, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, then chief of staff to President Ford, Jude Wanniski, the legendary Wall Street Journal journalist. I'm curious. I want to hear sort of I guess, the backstory, how you tell the story. I mean, how long were you thinking about, sort of the Laffer curve, thinking about,
I've been
drawing
doing
the relationship between tax revenue and tax rates? Um, were you planning on, was the pitch plan, was it a planned thing, or
no.
was it unexpected that you were going to draw this
Well,
thing
let me tell you,
on the
I'd been
napkin?
teaching my classes on the Cobb-Douglas production function called the CLO model, which I developed long before I told you how I was frustrated. And then I did the model where I had 6 factors, 6 unknowns, and solved the systems there and showed all the different things there. And one of the things was that if you raise tax rates on a factor of production, the returns there, you reduce that factor's employment, you reduce other factors' employment because they're withdrawing the complementarities out. And sometimes revenues go up and sometimes they don't. You can overtax a factor, you can undertax it. And it's like any product in the marketplace. If you tax something too much, you're going to get less tax from that, and tax too little, less. And having dinner with them, and they just done the whip inflation now, which was a 5% tax surcharge. Jerry Ford's brilliant, incredibly insightful idea. Just stupid as it comes. And I was telling my classmate, Dick Cheney, who was my Yale classmate, and Don Rumsfeld, one of my best friends, I said, you guys, you may get 4% more revenue. You may get 3% more revenue, but you won't get 5% more revenue. And in fact, you may lose revenues. And then I went through and just did what I did for my class, which showed that you're overtaxed, you're going to get less revenues. You undertax, you'll get less revenues, but you'll still get positive. And they saw the light, I guess, and and Jude Wanniski was there and wrote Taxes, Revenues, and the Laffer Curve, and it's all legend from there on.
It's amazing. So I'm just curious, just on the Laffer curve, there's, I think, many debates. Nobody debates that the Laffer curve has some inverted U shape, that, it's, a 0% tax rate,
Sort
you
of
should get zero
straightforward,
tax
isn't
revenue.
it?
100% tax rate, there should be zero revenue. Nobody debates that. I think the debate comes in is, what's the shape of the Laffer curve? And I think there's debates about at what tax rate the revenue maximizing part of the
Sure.
curve is at. And I
Let
think,
me let me disagree with you first. When this was done at that time, the historical Laffer curve, which was everywhere, the Laffer curve goes back 1,000 years to the Muqaddimah and Ibn Khaldun. All the classical economists had it, clearly understood it. Price theory understood it completely. The Laffer curve, I didn't invent it and I didn't name it. But at that time in macro, that was not the case. They did the type of Congressional Budget Office and analysis that if you raise tax rates by 10%, revenues will go up by 10%. It was all static analysis, no dynamic. And that's what I brought into the discussion there at that time. That was very big difference, John, was that at that time, it was literally that if you raise tax rates, even at 110% tax rates, you still collected more revenue. There was no incentive effect of taxes on the supply of goods and services. Our common friend, Ed Shaw put it this way. He said, in the demand side models of monetarism and Keynesianism, supply is a rubber womb which accommodates unembarrassingly any fetus of aggregate demand. And this is where I got a lot of the supply side things were from Ed Shaw there at Stanford and Emile Desprez. But now the debate is, where is the proper point on the Laffer curve? That is correct. Everyone has completely conceded the Laffer curve. I mean, it's obvious. Everyone all conceded before I was born too, by the way, just for the record. Now the issue is there. And what you're finding out is the more and more you look at it, and the more people understand that it's not just output, it's tax sheltering. It's changing the location of your production, changing the timing of your production, changing the composition of your production, changing the volume of production, changing how much you report tax sheltering and all this stuff. That the Laffer curve's effect on revenues is getting lower and lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. Property tax rates in the range of 1 to 2% are now counterproductive with regard to revenues. International taxes are counterproductive with the tax base. The larger the tax base, the more likely it is that tax revenues will be increased. The longer you're willing to wait, the more likely it is that tax revenues will be lost. All of this stuff comes into now just how really dominant the prohibitive range of the Laffer curve is. I mean, just show it. Warren Buffett, in his 2011 letter to the New York Times on his income, where he paid $7.5 million, $6.9 million in taxes on an income of $12.5 billion, clearly showed that, he doesn't pay taxes. I mean, it's way out there. No one in the top 300 tax filers pay any taxes at all. They all shelter their income. I mean, clearly the Laffer curve works in all of these areas dramatically and hugely. It works in poor people. I mean, everyone knows what happens, when people's incomes go up and they get their welfare payments withdrawn, needs test, means test, and income tax. It works there too. I think what's happening in the debate is everyone's coming to realize that the prohibitive range of the Laffer curve now occurs at very low rates of taxation, 15, 10% of taxation. I mean, we went from 73% in 1921 to 25% then. Their tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners tripled. Clearly way in the prohibitive range. So what we're seeing in the debates now is every year it moves. Go look at Simon Bowmaker's a book, When the President Calls, and Marty Feldstein's switch in his policy. When he did that 86 Tax Act analysis, he found shockingly how all these guys with ease just shifted their income. And the 86 Tax Act paid for itself. Bang! The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act paid for itself in the first 2 years. In the first 2 years before we even got lags.
Well, it's amazing. I mean, one, I think it's a great point that you make. And, one, like, the Laffer curve is an object that can change over time. Certainly if people find ways to be more mobile with their either their capital or even their labor,
or even their reporting, not even with their labor or capital. Take real things aside. Just hiring a good shyster lawyer. That's all it takes. A good accountant.
Accountants, lawyers, accountant and lawyers are absolutely part of that. You're absolutely right. So, behavioral response,
huge part. Huge.
There's many
hiring
different
politicians.
things that can, right. And so it all comes down to this object of, the ETI, elasticity, taxable income, how does your income change in response to,
it's not elasticity of taxable, it's elasticity of reported income.
Right.
And just it's reported.
Exactly.
They make tons of unrealized capital gains increases. Our income. Take Simon, they're clearly income, but they're not taxed. And they have you have a step-up basis at death. Duh.
So it's not just incentive effects. It's many things that go into defining elasticity, taxable income, elasticity,
exactly,
in the shape of the Laffer curve. And we could also even have different Laffer curves for corporate income, for individual income, for capital gains type income, and obviously capital gains. And I think corporations are a little bit more mobile than individual income. So
not really, they aren't. They really aren't. You've got lawyers that can do it anywhere, at any time, any place. It's really amazing how
Well,
flexible.
certainly for high income people that can afford that at
Well,
least.
they're the people who do it. They're the ones that
Right.
pay the high
Exactly.
tax rates.
Right.
When you see a group of people hanging out with Obama Wama, don't think it's street people trying to explain to them what it's like being poor. These are people from Goldman Sachs who want to put in a new tax deduction there for campaign contributions. And rich people can buy everything. They have the ways, they have the means, they have the ability to do all they can change all these things. And don't think for a moment they won't use it instantaneously. It doesn't take a long time for them to figure this out. It takes one good meeting with a lawyer. And then
Hmm.
what you do is you hire all the IRS lawyers, which is what Morgenthau complained about. Every time they trained a good tax lawyer, the private sector came in offering him 10 times as much to come and work on their side against the tax lawyer. I mean, it's just nature.
So,
And
so
pretty girls attract guys. It doesn't take a long time.
absolutely. Now,
I
so
hope you're
I
enjoying
want to
this,
talk
by
about
the
the
way. I'm
Reagan era.
laughing with you. Yes, let's
I want
do
to talk about
Reagan.
just the Reagan era for a minute. The Reagan tax kind of legacy is a big one. The marginal
It's
top rate
huge.
is cut from the
Yep.
70% range to the 20,
28.
28 when he left office. And
Yep.
I'm curious, like what was the involvement of the Reagan Economic Policy Advisory Board during this time?
Not
There
much.
like yourself there.
Myself, it was a lot. I'd done my thing, the complete flat tax, which I'd written, which was a complete just flat tax from first dollar to last dollar, no deductions, exemptions, exclusions thing. Uh, we got the tax cut of 1981, ERTA, which is based upon Kennedy's tax cuts of 30% across the board, which
Hmm.
I was able to get Jack Kemp to do it because his middle name was French and he wanted the JFK the second. Oh boy! So we did that one. That one worked, but Reagan phased it in and it caused the 81, 82 depression. But then when we got to the 86 Act, which was the real one, that was on the paper I did, which was the complete flat tax. That one, we took the rate down to 28%. We went from 14 tax brackets to 2 tax brackets. We cut the corporate rate from 46 to 34%. We did deductions, got rid of deductions, exemptions, exclusion. It was static revenue neutral. I mean, that was the closest thing to God and heaven that ever existed. It reworked. It worked like mad. That's where Marty found that all the people's responses were the tax revenues and the rich went up on that. Go ask your friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think I think a lot of people would agree with you that certainly in the JFK and Reagan tax cutting era, we were on the right hand side of the Laffer curve and
We came down. Yeah,
cutting rates. I think you'd actually get a lot of agreement amongst many economists, and so it's an amazing time. But the JFK and Reagan revolution.
and Trump
Larry
too.
Kudlow, Brian Dimitrovic have a great book written on this and on
Yep,
this
they do.
and it's fascinating. I want to talk a little bit. I just want to put away from presidents and federal policy for a little bit because another part of your legacy is on top of working with presidents, you've had a lot of success in getting states to cut their tax rates, and there's many states ranging from Kansas under Sam Brownback. There's for
Yep.
example, there's Tennessee where you're living now. And so there's a lot of evidence in general, that shows that states that didn't cut taxes are now losing people. There's a lot of great work that's done by folks like Hoover scholars Josh Rao and his co-author Ryan Shu, showing the behavioral responses to state income taxation and looking at California and how many people have left California in response to further state tax increases in California. And I know you're one of these people. You lived in Southern California, and you now live in Nashville, Tennessee, which has a zero state income tax. So you, in fact, you yourself are part of this trend. I'm just curious, sort of at a broader picture. I mean, what in your mind is the legacy of tax relief in the states in the past few
Well,
decades?
it started off with Prop 13. I was very involved in that, as you may know, with Howard Jarvis and Paul Gann. And we cut the highest property tax rate in California from 2.7% effective rate to 1% in one evening. Bang, I worked with Jerry Brown closely. If you could see my wall here, when he came down, and I spent a lot of time with him and went up there to Sacramento the next day when it passed and worked with him on the subventions and getting it work. And started all that. We do the ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, does the rich states, poor states, the Alec Laffer rankings of all the states. And I've worked on it. Your guys have done a great job as well, and it just super. And yeah, it's really clear those 11 states that adopted an income tax since 1960 have really underperformed. The 9 states that don't have an income tax have way outperformed the states that have the highest income tax. It as Larry Gatlin says, it ain't rocket surgery. It's just common sense. Duh. I mean, why would you go to a high tax location if you can go to a lower tax location? No, I love, love, love California. And if it hadn't been for Prop 13, California would be West Virginia. Prop 13 is the only thing that keeps you guys alive. But if you look at it, coming here, we have no death tax, no state, all that stuff. I mean, it's really cool. And, it's a great place to be. Earning income with lower taxes is a lot more fun.
Yeah. Well, I just think now in the post-COVID era, I feel like in the 2010s, this was, sort of like a big debate. And, there's, folks like Paul Krugman who are, attacking you for advising Sam
But
Brown
he
back
doesn't do
in that
data. But
tax
he
cut.
doesn't do data. This is just opinion. Krugman sits there and says, "I caused the race riots in Buffalo." Okay, go for it, Paul. He doesn't do data, and the data are really very clear.
Right.
Low tax rate states outperform high tax rate states. Period. There are other things that matter. That's true, but that is clearly one of the biggest things that matters.
And I think I think in many respects you've won this argument, and perhaps it hasn't been said, and I just think it's really people's behavior that says it all. But in the post-COVID era, COVID sort of gave this excuse for so many people to move and to switch states. And what's happened now is you see these the significant migrations from all these states, Illinois, New York, California, to low-income tax states, the Texases and Californias. You see tons of businesses moving, tons of corporations moving, tons of people, especially high-income individuals who are leaving. And this is borne out in the data. Would point folks
Just
to Josh
for
Ryle's work.
decades and decades and decades.
Right. So I think you won that argument. I'm just curious. I want to talk about just economic stimulus for a moment, and sort of speaking of COVID. I mean, you and I actually wrote a few op-eds together in 2020 in National Review, Fox Business, and sort of how.
Yes, we did. We had some fun, didn't we?
We did. And this was amidst the debate about what to do with COVID and sort of stimulus, or really more, I'd say, social insurance. People, were not allowed to work. You had these terrible lockdowns. They were being enforced by the government.
Yep.
So there was a question of, what do we do to fill the gap or to help people? And I think we were on the side of arguing that it should be a thoughtful process in terms of what we do with businesses and employees, and how to help those relationships endure, sort of to offset the negative effects of the lockdown. So we argued for payroll tax cuts and negative payroll tax cuts that would be sort of superior to grants allocated by the Small Business Administration, along with unemployment insurance, just because it'd be a more efficient way to keep employers and employees.
Exactly.
Rather than working through the banking system, SBAs and through to do it. And I talked to a lot of people. We talked to a lot of people at the time, and the problem was the IRS didn't have the capacity to do it, to like turn the spigot the other way. That was the reason that I got. So I mean, there's some weird state capacity issue going on. I'm curious, sort of looking back
None
5 years.
of that matter. It's just a bad thought process. And this was with Mnuchin and Larry Kudlow. I talked with the president on this a couple of days after, and just the question you put it, you got a fixed sum of money. Which would you prefer to do? To give that money to people who don't work, or to cut taxes on people who do work?
Mm-hmm.
It's not. I've advocated along with you, I think, was the abolishment of the payroll tax for a year and a half. Same a dollar amount as the stimulus spending, same amount, static revenue there. Which you think would have worked better? Paying all these people money not to work, or having no payroll tax for a year and a half on people who do work?
Or even a wage subsidy to some degree.
Well, you don't even have to do that. Just cut the payroll tax. That's a wage subsidy if you want to think of it. Stop taxing wages, both employer and employee, and you'll increase employment dramatically. The wedge will be different, just reduced. That's all.
Yeah.
Bing.
Yeah.
And that's what we should have done. We would have never had the problem. In 2008, when they had the Great Recession, as they called it. My solution to that back then was to have a complete cessation of all federal taxes for a year and a half. Same dollar amount. Can you imagine no federal taxes, no payroll taxes, no capital gains taxes, no death taxes, no income taxes, no income, all these, get rid of all federal taxes for a year and a half, which is the exact same amount as Obama, Wama, and Bushy Wushy spent on it, did that. Can you imagine what would happen to this country if we had no federal tax at all? We'd be selling cars into central China. You know, these guys all think that writing checks is the same thing as not collecting taxes. It's not true. It's totally different, John. And the Keynesians and the monetarists don't understand that. They really don't. Milton Friedman, in the Monetary History of the United States, doesn't mention income taxes in 1930s. We raised the highest tax rate from 25% to 63% on January 1st, 1932. We shortened the brackets. We then raised it all the way up in 1937. We raised it to 79%. Then we raised it to 94% in 1944. Hello! Is it going to surprise you? But where is that in the monetary history of the United States? It's not. Because that's not where these people were focusing on then. And that's what you and I and a bunch of others have brought back into the thing, is the classical marginal rates of substitution between labor and leisure. And that's what drives the system.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, I'm with you. You know, I think there is this.
I know you are.
You know, there's this massive renaissance in fiscal research that I think shows that, you know, the fiscal multipliers, you know, are
negative,
statistically much lower. You know, much closer to zero.
You're not gonna put them. They're negative, John.
Well, it depends on how you measure. I think to some degree.
They made the mistake. If it's not negative, they made a mistake in how they measured it.
Well, you do have to pay it back over time, right? So, like, you know, so there might be some positive effects in this year, but you will eventually have to tax.
I'm going to do this with you. I'm going to do
All
this
right.
with
So
you.
I want to, my last question for you, I think is an interesting one. And one I want to talk about
Sure.
Trump economic policy for a bit. But you know, 2018, you wrote the book Trumponomics with Steve Moore, and
Yep.
you know, you described the Trump economic agenda. And I think fairly well in that book. You know, I'm curious, how would you? We've talked about the successes so far. I think we're on the same page with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and you know, we hadn't had a big corporate reform since the 1980s, since the 86 Act, and you know, in terms of, you know, the one big beautiful bill, extending many of the items from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, making some of them permanent, full expensing. Permanency is terrific.
Wonderful. Just
Josh
wonderful.
Rao, Kevin Hassett, myself, also Hoover Fellows, wrote a paper on this when it was sort of up in the air, and I think we, along with many others, influenced some of that debate and
You sure did.
permanence on at least for equipment and R&D. Those are permanent. Structures is now fully expensed. That will be is going to have to be renewed or will expire in a few years. But we've got most of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you know, which you obviously, you know, played a huge part in, has been extended and many parts of it made permanent. Lots of evidence that we've shown that
It's worked really well.
It influences capital spending, CapEx, and I think at some level, you know, it's a shame that, you know, we left corporate tax rates as high as we did for so many decades, and it's great that we now have full expensing, like permanent full expensing, like some other countries do as well. So all good for incentivizing corporations to purchase property, plant, and equipment. You know, that's a boon for the economy. I'm just curious, you know, what remains left to be done in your mind, or what's sort of the next in economic policy, and it's in particular as it relates to tax policy. And I'm curious also, like, you know, I think it's fair to say that, you know, the GOP has a lot of divided minds on economic policy these days. You know, there's you know, what some people call the new right. There's folks like Orrin Cass that have you know, that very much rail against, I would say, your legacy. You know, the legacy of the supply siders, you know, who talk about, you know, Reagan tax cutting and you know, I guess, you know, JFK tax cutting and others, and you know, the Trump tax cuts as well, to varying degrees. unfavorably, and they're, I think, maybe more focused on maybe redistribution, but you also have big proponents of tariffs. You have big proponents of say child tax credits, family policy. You have big proponents of just of union policy and so forth, and to really completely change the GOP's economic policy to be less focused on, I'd say, growing the pie for the entire economy, and to be focused in certain areas. So I'm curious what you think about that shift. I think those people are ascendant in the GOP. It's hard to say how much power I think they truly have, but I mean I think they've had a lot of influence on not just President Trump, but in particular, JD Vance and I think Marco Rubio as well. I think is fair to say. I'm curious what you think about that sort of internal split within the GOP.
I'd say based on data, they don't make much sense at all in that stuff. I mean, I look at Trump and I think he's probably the most transformational president in U.S. history. I mean, I tease him about Reagan all the time. I mean, I say, sir, Reagan got the highest rate down to 28%. You're stuck at 37, and he always said, "But how would you?" We have fun in that stuff,
Well,
but
he's got a portrait of Ronald Reagan in the Oval
of
Office
course,
now.
well, who doesn't? I mean, I think God has a portrait of Reagan in his office. I mean, come on. But if you look at it there, we have a couple of things to do on taxes. We do have a little bit to go to match Reagan, the low rate, broad based, flat tax, the one I did for Jerry Brown when he ran for president in '92. But the one I think is the sleeper that you haven't mentioned is healthcare price transparency. And that is a huge one, John. I think if you got some of your guys to work on that, that you post transactions prices so that people can make their decisions as to what they want their healthcare to be, you'd reduce the insurance market dramatically. You would make the system really efficient. Life expectancy in the U.S. has been declining dramatically over the last 55 years versus the OECD. Expenses have been going up, all because no one knows what the prices are, the transactions prices. That's a huge area. And it's about 17, 18% of GDP. I'm talking to the president about this. In fact, he did the executive order in his first term on that. That I think is big. And I think what he's doing is just super on that stuff. I mean, I don't know, other than creating peace for the world in Ukraine, peace for the world with the Houthis, peace for the world in 85 other conflicts, including prosperity for everyone else, having everyone smiling and happy, having ice cream cones. I mean, this is the single most transformational administration ever. Reagan was amazing. I mean, really amazing. But Trump is just, oh my God, he's going to cure everything. And he is. And in 6 months, look what he's done. I mean,
No, it's amazing. Just
energy decontrol. Have you seen what the results of that have been? I mean, wow. I mean,
mhm.
and I think the left is shifting. I think they realize, I mean, when Hillary Clinton said that if he succeeds on the Ukraine-Russian war, he should get the Nobel Peace Prize. What? Hillary said that about Trump. How cool is that? I think the Democrats are going to be the newest, freest market. It's like all the people we got from the Eastern Bloc once the wall fell down. Once you've lived under communism, you want free enterprise all the rest of your life. And I think all the Democrats are going to love becoming really hardcore Trump Republicans. The
Yeah.
Trump derangement syndrome is going to turn into the Trump love syndrome. And all of these, Gavin Newsom, oh my God, how can I follow my inner Trump? I mean, they're all going to do that very soon. You watch the changes that these guys are making.
Yeah.
They're going to become us, John.
We'll see. We'll see how Emmanuel and some of these other Dem moderates. I'm curious. Any thoughts on the new right and sort of those that are out there who are really going after your legacy and sort of the going after the supply side legacy?
There have been mistakes made all over the place, and incentives matter. And if
Hmm.
you look at the research there, how can you get anything more than what I did with Brian Dimitrovic and Gene Sinkfield, by the way, and taxes have consequences. I mean, we looked at every single tax return. It's not a sampling problem. We know the last guy in the top 1%. We know the first guy in the bottom 9. We don't have their names, but we know how many dependents they have. We have all the data, everything there. It's all from Sias Piketty, by the way. It's all from the Institute of Inequality up at MIT. They've got great data. It's just they don't know how to use it.
Hmm.
And if you look at it, every time we've raised the highest tax rate, the economy's underperformed. tax revenues from the rich have gone down, and the poor have been hammered. Every
Mhm.
time we've lowered tax rates on the rich, the economy has
Mhm.
outperformed, tax revenues from the rich have gone up, and the poor have been provided opportunities and jobs and better lives. What
Mhm.
more do you want? I mean, I've got all the other numbers in there as well. I mean, I'm just talking about the inequality people, but who's against poor people having higher incomes? Who on earth is against that?
Absolutely. Amen. No, I couldn't agree with you more.
And these guys are not using the data correctly, and they're just me. And
But
I'd
they
love to have.
definitely have a different social welfare function. I think that's definitely
No,
very.
they don't. They have they don't know data, and so they make assumptions that by taking from the rich you can help the poor. That's bullshit. Excuse me, that's bull poop. It's not true. Whenever you try to take from the rich, you get less money. You get
Mhm.
less money, you have less to give to the poor. I would love to do a debate at Hoover if you guys wanted to sponsor it with Saez or Piketty or any of those. You just get it there, make it a Hoover institution. We'll make it 2 hours so we can get through the one-liners and the slur, the slurs and the slams and the sort of, virtue signaling and all that crap, and get down to serious stuff. What did happen with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? What happened with the Kennedy tax cuts? What happened with the Reagan tax cuts? What happened with the Trump tax cuts? What happened with the tax increases under Hoover? What happens with the tax increases under Roosevelt? What happened with all of these? We have those data. Let's sit down
Mhm.
and see what happened. What happened? And
I couldn't agree more.
Gab, your guy,
I'll work on
propose
putting
it
that
there. I'll come
together.
and do it. But you got to make it long enough so it's not it's not a slogan slamming thing. I did this in UT Austin with Galbraith, Jamie Galbraith, and at the end he said, "Laffer, you're right. The '86 Tax Act was the best thing for inequality, the best thing for the economy ever." I mean, they know they're wrong. They
Mhm.
just need to be shown it, and with their data.
As an empirical economist, I couldn't
I
agree
know you are. You're the best,
more.
by the way.
Thanks. That's very
And
kind.
Well,
Well,
it's true. And, Kevin Hass is the best. I mean, you've got the greatest advisor in Kevin. And Kogan, too, by the way, that you've got some great people there at Hoover. Sponsor that debate, and I'll do it. And
I'll
Sias
work
can
on it.
flop down from Berkeley. He could even bring my classmate with him, Georgie Akerlof. Bring him down with him. Bring Janet down, Yellen. Let's have a serious one-on-one, mano a mano. Facts. Let's see what it is. Proposition. We should
I'll
raise
work on
tax
it.
rates on the rich. That
I'll
should be
work
the
on it.
proposition. I say no, they say yes.
I'll work on it. I really want to thank you for coming on. This has been
I
an
love it,
amazing
John. I'm
conversation.
so proud of you. I can't stand it, by the way, just for the I've known you for a long time. We've done work together.
We
You
have.
are a great, promising young man. One of my sessions with George, it was on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors, and I think it was 2005. George Shultz, myself, Milton Friedman were there, and I was complaining about something. I said, "God damn it, I'm 65 years old and I'm sick." And George, who had this power over me that whenever he raised his voice, it was like my dad. He scared the hell out of me. "Arthur, stop right there." And I bumped. I said, "I just want you to know that I still consider you a promising young man." And I looked at him, and I can't stop from commenting on things. So I looked at him and said, "And I suppose that's what Milton says to you, is it, George?" He said, "Absolutely not. Milton never mentioned the word promising." Just great. I miss those days. I miss you guys. I miss California. Uh, but I don't miss the taxes. I don't miss the regulations. I don't miss the hostility. We here in Tennessee, if you drive by someone, you're driving your car and you see a car coming or a truck coming the other way, you go like that on the steering wheel. In California, it's the same thing, but they use a different finger. And, the hostilities you have there in a state-run organization, things are just really overbearing. Not only do we have lower tax rates, more prosperity, more in-migration, less out-migration, better education improvements, and all of that stuff, which we do, we also have less anger, less hostility. Yes, it's low taxes solve all sorts of problems. Stable money solves all sorts of problems. Deregulation solves all sorts. Free trade solves all sorts of problems. I mean, government cutting government spending solves all sorts of problems. Low rate, broad-based flat taxes, spending restraint, sound money, minimal regulation, free trade, and then get the hell out of the way and let the economy solve its own problems. They'll do a lot better job than government people or people working in socialist organizations like Hoover. You are a socialist organization. Pay is not determined by how many students you get. It's pay is not market driven. And I've never really believed anyone from a university can be a conservative. You can't be a conservative living in a socialist state and liking it. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it, John. You got to get out in the private sector for a while.
The private sector, I agree. I've spent some time there, and there's nothing like it that's more meritocratic than the
Well,
private
you
sector.
enjoy life very much, and thank you for having me. I've been waiting for your phone call to do that debate. Anyone you want, I'd be glad to do it.
All right. Thanks so much, Art, for coming on. This is the Capitalism and Freedom, the 21st Century Podcast, an official podcast of the Hoover Institution Economic Policy Working Group, where we talk about economics, markets, and public policy. I'm Jon Hartley, your host. Thanks so much for joining us.